sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. Hello and welcome to the 2021 Library of Congress National Book Festival. I am Idelmi Noriega, Director of Programs at the Poetry Foundation, and I am here with two fantastic authors, poets Francine J. Harris and Patrick Rosal. Tonight, we will be speaking with them about their new books. Francine's book is Here is the Sweet Hand. Patrick's is The Last Thing, New and Selected Poems. To learn more about our authors, please visit loc.gov/bookfest. But before we begin, I want to let you know that we'll save the last 10 minutes of today's 30-minute live event to respond to audience questions. You can start submitting your questions now. And with that, I'd love to welcome Francine to join us, as well as Patrick. And each of our poets will begin with a poem. Hello, Francine. Hello, Patrick. Good evening. Francine, hi. I wonder if you can kick us off, Francine, with your reading this evening.
Of course. Thank you. I'm going to read the first poem from the book. It's called Versal. The wood is not a Negro with tree and the farm split sand for almighty. Not a road to bend over, not a lakeside or sideways log stump, not a sidelong, not a strangler clutch or fruiting body of fungus. The worn of wood is not hiding in bark, in deer soot or elk piss musk, not in camouflage, not a snowshoe a Negro, not a cowhide stripped or over sprawl. The tree is not a loner type, not a sleeper cell, not a jumpy trigger. The foliage low hangs a lake I like, an ice cave shot, a hit tide frozen in place. And a black girl is standing on it, over a river rocking, side bank isn't thug among us. Not a rush gang, not a flower snatched from sidewalks, which isn't breaking in root. Nothing for jewels, isn't watching through windows. The black meadow isn't sniper squatting, cheapening the field reek. Eyesore cattail driving down, the sound of stream drive by. The wood is an eager, a negus among us, a runner like eagle, a brown sighting, root system gathered and growl of curl of amassed vein feed. Say it with us. The wood is a falcon, a clean stretch of might. The dark bark is humming, night stretched. A reserve is craning in its path glow pitchfall, matted grass attriment, blowing night like long husk, and a black girl is standing in it.
Thank you, Francine, for that. Patrick, would you share a poem with us, please?
Sure. I'm gonna read a section of a longer poem. This is a poem called The Changing Hymn, and it's for my wife, who is a singer, and it's about a singer, a beautiful singer who can get people to move and dance and can use things in the room to sort of remake the song as she's singing. So this is the middle part of the poem. My darling loved most to sing in dark places, especially dank bars packed with locals who were swift to rise from their crummy chairs and stagger to their feet, setting their drinks on the closest table. Or they'd simply fling their glasses to the floor to finally hold one another so close they could sniff each other's cheeks, though hardly anyone knew another's name. My love put their tables in her song, and the back room's musty wood, and the dusty lavender smell of factories beside the perfume of goat breath like a gift inside the song. And sometimes the crowd would swell into laughter all together to see if such a singer and such a song could hold the joyful sound of 100 strangers, and they would stomp and twirl to see if their dance could keep up with my love song. And with all their singing and swinging, stepping and sliding, they forgot their walking legs and their meat hooks and the thick pine smell that haunted their saws. My lover's song so fearless, sometimes the dead got up too. For even the most crotchety of our elders knew if we opened ourselves up wide enough to the song would never leave us, even lying down. And this is how her singing became a country that could go everywhere. A vagabond that moved through whoever welcomed it. This is how a song became a little nation inside 100 people grooving so hard no one could say exactly what a nation was. The land, the people upon it, or the ones buried in the fields and hills, for the dancers were pure tremor, cycle, and vibration. Migrants, they were pure wave.
Beautiful.
So beautiful.
Thank you both so much. I think both of the poems that you just read put us right into the world of that scene, of that narrative that you're bringing your reader into. And I definitely want to get into the specifics of those poems and how you did it and how you do that in your work broadly. But I'd love to start with a question about the theme for this year's book festival, which is open a book, open the world. And I wonder, Pat, if you would go first, can you talk to us about books that opened your world and how books have opened up the world for you?
So many. I have to say that I came to reading quite late. I think that a lot of folks who become writers, they're avid readers when they're very young, but I didn't read books a whole lot. My early training as a writer really is as a musician. My dad was a musician. I was around musicians all the time and around music. I was a DJ and b-boy, and all of that was kind of training for my reading and my writing life when I finally arrived at it seriously in my 20s. And the books that I read then Sandra Cisneros was huge. House on Mango Street. To have such a slim book capture so much of something that was very familiar to me in terms of being around working class folks and immigrant folks, and the way that she captures language and experience. But there's so many. Eduardo Galeano is another one who's really important. His Book of Embraces and his Trilogy of Fire, of course, really been really important to me. But I could easily spend the whole half hour talking about the books that have opened my world.
Francine.
Thank you. It's interesting what Pat said about growing up with different kinds of input. And I grew up on the east side of Detroit and didn't necessarily go to like the greatest schools with the best resources. So it's funny when you say that, like the first thing that I think about are the books that opened my world were textbooks, where I found little snatches of things like Robert Frost or Robert Hayden. They were just single poems like Middle Passage or Walking Through Woods on a Snowy Evening. They were just little moments. And maybe it's funny when you ask it that way, I sort of wonder if that wasn't part of the reason that I became a poet, because the poem can sort of still itself in just like one moment. And it was often moments where I was just grateful to have a little snatch of something. Of course, when I got older, there were a few of the books that I think maybe kind of continued to open that world, where like I's Cruelty was one of the early books that I remember thinking, whoa, like something else is possible when she's sort of embodying all these people that were outside of her own experience. Or even Sylvia Plath's Ariel was one of the books that sort of, I feel like, broke me open. So as I got older, it was the full collections. But when I was younger, I was just so grateful for the kind of curated field of poems that was available to me.
I appreciate that. I think we often hear about how textbooks aren't necessarily the most engaging way in for young people into poems, and how often we don't find ourselves in the poems that are put in front of us via textbooks. So it's nice to be reminded that yes, that happens too sometimes. But so many of the poets that you both have named, like Galeano, Cisneros, I, Plath, do a thing that I think you both do very well, which is create narrative, right? And tell stories, full stories in poems. And the characters that you create and bring alive through those poems, I think shine in both of your work. So I wonder if you could spend a little bit of time talking about narrative and storytelling and how you do that in the poems that you write.
Sure. I mean, I'm gonna be brief here and let Pat go, because Pat is the master of the story. It's one of the things I was reminded of in reading this beautiful new book of his, that he sort of trucks in the field of storytelling. And actually, I think as a poet, I sort of grew up seeing myself as being a little more interested in imagery and kind of meditative interiority. But I was just talking to some students the other day about the fact that I think perhaps I've been lying to myself a little bit. I was grateful enough to study with A. Van Jordan at University of Michigan. And I feel like he maybe was the first person who made me realize how much I loved storytelling. And that even though I guess I thought I was resisting narrative in my work, I have always been interested in thinking about the dilemma, like the situation, like what's happening in this poem, and where is the speaker speaking from? Like what's going on in their environment, which is really kind of like how stories begin, right? There's, you know, the setting, and then there's what has changed, what's shifted to sort of trigger the story or the poem. And I think I've been doing that all along. So, but I want Pat to talk about it because I really want to hear what he has to say.
Thanks, Francine. I have to say that, like, when I went to grad school in the mid to late 90s, probably the worst thing, my least developed skill as far as sort of like being in an MFA program was storytelling. And I set out to learn how to tell a story in a poem. I loved, being a DJ and having produced records. I was used to composing in fragments. The lyric mode was like it was really my first mode. And then I started reading narrative poems, Toy Derricott and Philip Levine. And I also had an impulse to honor the storytellers that I grew up with on the stoop, in the kitchen table. My older brother is a great storyteller. He's got so many really good stories. Like, out of the crew that I hung out with, by far, I am not the best storyteller, and so I grew up around people who just knew how to tell a story. So I learned how to do that inside of a poem. But I think the other thing that I want to say is that, it's hard for me to differentiate between that sort of that lyric musical impulse and the storytelling impulse, the narrative impulse. For me, when I think about stories, like I think about, stories that my aunts and uncles and cousins tell, at family gatherings, they're not whole. They're not like,
Right.
they're not Aristotelian, they're fragmented. Sometimes they're not finished. They're blown out of proportion, and they're highly musical and rhetorical. And more and more, the longer I write, the more I realize that all of my poems, my narrative poems included, and maybe especially, all my poems aspire to the quality of music, all of them, which is rhythm and sound and repetition and variation and invocation. And I like to think that even if somebody doesn't understand English, that I could perform one of my poems, or somebody could simply read my poems phonetically, and there would be a kind of sonic meaning making that happens, and that has to be part of the architecture of the storytelling in the poem. Otherwise, it's not a poem to me.
That's incredible. And Francine, I'll concede that Patrick gets the title for storytelling, but I think you get the title for like characterization and characters in poems. And I want to dig right into that, right? Like Pat, you talk about the structure, like how, and I'd like you both to address this. Patrick, if you can say a little bit more about like, how do you build the structure of a poem? Of a story into your poem as you're crafting it. And Francine, if you can answer the same question in terms of how you build your characters in your poems.
Sure. Who goes first? You want me to say?
Who's ready?
Go ahead, Francine.
I think I was just thinking, this is going to be almost an essentialist statement. And so I'm sure that I'll say it and then I'll disagree with myself as soon as I say it. But I do think a lot about what it means to want to invite, to allure a kind of communication or understanding. Right, there's this very kind of like private coded language of poetry that can do a lot of that work. But then there's a little seed, I think, and it does, and obviously this can go a lot of different directions, and I know it sounds a little essentialist, I guess, but there is a little seed in the story that is about me to you and conveying and communicating, and you understanding. And I think that's the most beautiful thing that a story can do. Of course, there's a trust level there too, right? Like you have to, believe that, what is coming to you is from a place of goodness and love. But so when I think about characters in stories, I think maybe there's sort of like, characters in poems. I guess I think of them often as channels, figures, the way kind of from me as poet to listener, reader, whatever that place is out there. So I'm not necessarily invested in them as protagonists or anything like that, but just that they seem to be the only ones that would know how to do that. Like they're the only ones. That figure is the only one. Even actually, the speaker in the poem that I read, I don't exactly think of as me. I think of that figure as the Black girl that really knows those woods, that really knows like how to be in that environment and understands the creatures around her, maybe in a way that I don't even. So she's the only one that would have that language that comes from that poem. I think that's kind of how I think about character or figuration.
Thank you.
That's a really hard question.
It is, right?
I have a lot of answers. I'm gonna try to narrow it down to something that can make a little bit of sense. But I think there's a couple of things. One is that I'm always not always, but I'm often trying to see the character, like literally, like what is this figure doing? And that rests on a kind of assumption, which is that I don't know who this person is. Even if it is based on my wife or somebody in my family, I I have to have the assumption that I'm trying to learn something about this figure that I don't know, and I know very little. And in the process of drawing the image of this person and their environment and their interactions in language, they become clearer to me. And then I'm going to say something really that contradicts that, which is that I'm constantly following the figure so that I'm going to get lost. I want to be lost in the process of imagining, rendering this figure. I'm going towards my lostness over and over again. And this process of pursuing being lost slowly reveals to me not just this figure, this character, but my relationship to that character. So you know, like I'm either I think that some characters end up being one-dimensional because like it's easy to jump on the like, oh, this is neat. But I'm also like looking at the edges and the details that might draw me towards a quality that is confounding, confusing, even terrifying. And I think that that's one way that I end up sort of constructing these figures. And the last thing that I'll say is that in that whole process of being lost, that the music is sort of my compass. The music helps me get lost.
Well, thank you. Thank you, both of you, for those answers. Because I think it shines a little bit of a light in why your poems are as amazing as they are. I wish we could talk for hours, but we can't. And so we've come to the time of the program where I'm gonna share some audience questions. And in the interest of time, the first one I'm gonna combine two. I'm gonna combine a question from Georgia and a question from Marion. And so the questions are, was there a particular poem for each of you that inspired you to start writing poems? And then the second part of the question would be, how much do you think about your audiences when you're writing, and who do you write for? Francine, can you take it first?
If there was one poem, kinda. There was one poem. I've talked about this recently. There's a poem by Robert Louis Stevenson, if I can remember, but I can't remember the name of it. So I can't really talk about it because I can't remember the name of it. But I will say that it was about being sick in bed, and I had to memorize it. Gosh, what was the name of that poem? I can't talk about it because I can't remember the name of it. So, but one of the poems that I did mention was the Snowy Woods in the Evening, the Robert Frost poem, because I think it was the first poem that I read that I felt, I guess I understood whatever that voice is that, you know, sort of kicks into its quiet gear that allows you to do what Patrick is talking about, which is like find that music. You know, it's just a little stillness in your head. I felt that and I think it was just the setting, kind of, I guess, back to the storytelling mode. It was probably every time I think about winter, so the thing that I remember most is the setting of that Robert Frost poem. Something in that just clicked with something old in my soul. And I guess I wanted to maybe be a part of that. So those are two early poems. If I can remember the name of that other poem, I'll mention it.
Yeah, for me, I can't think of a single poem. I was so voracious. I was reading a lot of different folks at the same time when I first started writing poems. I'm sure Ginsberg's Howl was in there, and Robert Hayden's Frederick Douglass was in there, and Amiri Baraka's In Agony Is Now, and Anne Sexton's poem to her friend, This Is What Poems Are, With Mercy for the Greedy, which is like, in which like the end rhyme is hidden in that poem. So that was, I think that it's more than one poem. There's a constellation of poems in that period of my life, of the early to mid 1990s, that really got me going. And I can't remember the second half of that question.
Audience, do you think about audience when you write, and do you write for someone in particular?
I mean, I would say yes, but it changes, you know, like sometimes that person, and as a matter of fact, sometimes I feel like what's happening in a this isn't always true, but sometimes I feel like what's happening in a poem is that I'm writing until I realize who I'm talking to. You know, you sort of pitch around and then you figure out like, oh, and maybe that's where aboutness comes from, that you know, sort of let things happen and let it be free. And then you start to notice the patterns and you're like, oh, wait a minute. I know who this is about, or I know who this is for, you know, but that often changes, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I love that, figuring out sort of who you're writing to as you go along, because that's not one of the things that you think about in terms of discovery during composition, but that, I love that a lot. And in some ways, maybe even if you're thinking of someone, like I was going to say, I want my wife to love my poems, you know?
Aww, yeah.
I think that, you know, in general, like even before I met her, before we were married, in general, like I just want people who are beloved to me to love my poems. And so somewhere in my mind, they're there. And what Francine said about you know, the addressee getting clearer, like maybe in a way, the process of writing, the process of making music, the process of writing stories, maybe one of the sort of consequences of that is that your addressee, a kind of a beloved, becomes clear to you as you are writing. So yeah, family, friends, but also like I've also been thinking about the dead, and I write towards the dead. I also write towards folks who are not born yet, and they too are beloved to me. They have the qualities of my beloveds.
Absolutely.
That's wonderful. We're almost at the end of time, and so I want to ask one more question that came in from the audience, and it's for Patrick, and it says, Patrick, can you talk about putting together a new and selected? How do you approach it as a book, and how do you make the tough decisions?
I'm looking at this clock and there's 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And it took me 20 years to write that book. So the first thing is that you got to write for a while, I think. I don't know. I look at this thing and I'm not really sure how I put it together. I mean, I do start putting the poems together to think about, like, if there are threads that hold it together. How do these new poems, what's the story of my imagination and my sort of witness over the last 20 to 25 years? And so I'm sort of pulling out poems that lead folks, maybe even teach folks how to read the newer poems. And I guess I also think about it musically. I think about it as a kind of orchestration of parts in conversation with one another. And so hopefully, if people read the whole book, that they'll see those resonances happen throughout all the poems and over time.
That's wonderful. Well, I think we're almost at time. So first, we had a lot of questions, so I'm sorry to the audience members that we've run out of time and we were unable to ask those questions and have the poets answer them. But I do hope that you continue enjoying the festival. A very special thank you to our two authors, poets Francine J. Harris and Patrick Rosal. It has been an absolute honor to be be in conversation with you tonight. So thank you all so much for sharing your time with us so generously. And thank you to the audience for all of your questions. And thank you to the team at the Library of Congress for putting this fantastic festival together. You all can keep enjoying the National Book Festival at the website loc.gov/bookfest. Thank you all so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for moderating.
You're welcome. This was a blast.